The distant wail of a coyote pierced the darkness as Zane Alderman crossed his property, lantern swinging in hand, its yellow light dancing across the damp spring grass of Montana Territory, 1876. Something had spooked the horses, not coyotes. He knew their sounds too well for that, and after 6 years of solitary ranching, he developed an almost primal sense for when things weren't right on his land. The barn door hung slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it after evening feed. Zane paused, setting the lantern down on a nearby stump. With practiced silence, he drew his Colt revolver from its holster, the weight familiar against his palm. At 32, he'd seen enough trouble to know caution often meant the difference between life and death in these untamed lands. Inside, the barn was unnaturally quiet. Even Thunderhead, his temperamental stallion, stood eerily still in his stall, ears pricked forward toward the back corner where the hay was stored. Zane raised his lantern higher, its glow gradually revealing a bundle of fabric tucked between 2 hay bales. The bundle moved. "I've got a gun trained on you," Zane called out, voice steady. "Show yourself, nice and slow." The hay rustled, and a face emerged, a woman's face, streaked with dirt and framed by tangled dark hair. Her eyes, wide with terror, reflected the lantern light. She clutched something to her chest, something small and wrapped in a tattered blanket. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking with desperation. "Please don't let them take my baby." Zane lowered his weapon slightly, but maintained his distance. The woman couldn't have been more than 25, her clothes torn and muddied. And there, nestled against her breast, was indeed an infant, tiny and remarkably quiet. "Who's after you?" Zane asked, eyes darting toward the barn door. "Men from town," she said, pulling herself up to sitting position. "Bad men. They'll be here by morning. I just needed somewhere to rest." Her voice broke. "We've been running for days." Zane hesitated. He'd built his life here on solitude after the war, purposely distancing himself from the complications of other people's troubles. But something in her eyes, a fierce determination beneath the fear, struck him deeply. "What's your name?" he asked, finally holstering his weapon. "Willow," she answered, then glanced down at the bundle in her arms. "Willow Michaels. And this is Benjamin." Little did Zane know that this encounter in his barn on this spring night would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about trust, and about what it meant to truly find home. The rhythmic creaking of the rocking chair filled the small cabin as Zane placed another log on the fire. Willow sat across from him, the baby finally asleep in her arms after she'd cleaned herself up with the basin of water he'd provided. In the firelight, Zane could see her more clearly, high cheekbones, a small scar above her right eyebrow, and eyes the color of sage after rain. "You should eat something," he said, gesturing to the plate of beans and cornbread he'd set before her. His cooking was nothing special, but it was hot and filling. "Thank you," Willow whispered, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "For all of this?" Zane nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. He'd been alone too long, speaking more to his horses than to people these past years. The cabin, built with his own hands after returning from the war, had never held a woman or child before. "You mentioned men from town," he said, getting to the point. "What men?" Willow's expression darkened as she shifted little Benjamin to one arm and reached for the spoon. "My husband died 3 months ago. Mining accident near Virginia City. I thought his brother would help us." She took a small bite, chewing slowly. "Calvin, my brother-in-law, he's a gambling man with debts. He told people in town he'd sell Benjamin to a wealthy couple from back east who can't have children of their own." Zane's jaw clenched. "Sell your son." "For $800, she said, voice hollow. "When I refused, he claimed I was unfit. Said I was touched in the head with grief. He has friends in town, including the sheriff. They were going to take Benjamin yesterday, but I overheard their plans. Her eyes, when they met his, held no tears, only cold determination. I left with what I could carry. I've been heading north ever since. Zane stood abruptly and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to scan the darkness beyond. The moon had risen, casting silver light across his property. No riders yet, but if they discovered her missing, they wouldn't be far behind. "You got folk somewhere?" "Somewhere you can go?" he asked. Willow shook her head. "My parents died years ago. I was working as a seamstress when I met James. After we married, we moved west for the mining opportunities." Her voice softened. "He was a good man. Had dreams of buying land someday, raising cattle. Like this." She gestured around the modest cabin. Zane turned from the window, studying her. In his experience, trust came at too high a price. The war had taught him that much. Yet something about her story rang true. He'd seen enough desperation in his life to recognize the genuine article. "I've got a root cellar," he said finally. "Hidden entrance behind the woodpile. If anyone comes looking, that's where you'll hide." Relief washed over Willow's face. "Just until tomorrow night," she promised. "Then we'll move on." "Where to?" Zane asked. The question hung in the air between them. Willow looked down at her sleeping son, and for the first time, her composure cracked. "I don't know," she admitted, a single tear trailing down her cheek. "I just know I can't let them take him." Zane turned away, uncomfortable with her emotion. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly. "You can have the bed. I'll take the chair." "Mr. Alderman, Zane," he corrected. "Zane," Willow repeated. "Why are you helping us?" "You don't know me." He paused at the door, hand on the frame. The honest answer was that he didn't rightly know himself. Maybe it was the echo of his own mother's voice, who'd raised him to help those in need. Maybe it was the weight of all the things he'd failed to protect during the war. Or maybe it was simply that in this vast, lonely country, turning away a desperate woman and her child felt like the one sin he couldn't bear to commit. "Get some rest," he said again, avoiding the question entirely. Morning comes early. The first light of dawn found Zane already in the barn, feeding the horses and checking the perimeter of his property. He'd slept poorly, ears tuned to any unusual sound, hand never far from his revolver. The woman and her baby had slept soundly enough, exhaustion finally claiming them both. He was mucking out Thunderhead's stall when he heard the approaching hoofbeats, 3 riders by his count, coming fast along the main road. Dropping the pitchfork, Zane strode quickly back to the cabin. Willow was already awake, standing by the window with Benjamin cradled against her shoulder. Her face was pale but composed when she turned to him. "They're coming," she said simply. Zane nodded. "Cellar. Now." He led her to the back of the cabin, shifting the woodpile to reveal the trapdoor beneath. The space below was clean and dry, used for storing potatoes and preserves through the harsh Montana winters. Not a sound, he instructed as she carefully descended the ladder, baby held tight against her. "No matter what you hear." Fear flickered in her eyes, but she nodded resolutely. Zane closed the trapdoor, replaced the woodpile, and had just settled himself at the table with a cup of coffee when the riders pulled into his yard. Through the window, he recognized Sheriff Davis from town, along with 2 men he'd seen but couldn't name. One, a thick-set man with a neat mustache and expensive clothes, dismounted first. Something in his bearing reminded Zane of officers he'd known during the war, men who expected obedience without question. Zane took his time answering the pounding at his door. "Alderman." Sheriff Davis nodded curtly. "This here's Calvin Michaels. We're looking for his sister-in-law. Woman traveling with an infant. Seen anyone fitting that description?" Calvin Michaels stepped forward, all forced charm and oiled hair. "My poor sister-in-law has been deeply disturbed since my brother's passing," he explained, voice dripping with false concern. "Doctor says it's female hysteria. She's taken my nephew and run off, and I fear for the child's safety. Zane leaned against the doorframe, expression neutral. Haven't seen anyone, he said flatly. Been busy with spring calving. Haven't even been to town in weeks. The third man, younger and nervous-looking, shifted in his saddle. We tracked her this direction, Mr. Alderman. Are you certain? I said I haven't seen anyone. Zane cut him off. Unless you've got a warrant to search my property, I suggest you move along. Daylight's burning, and I've got work to do. Calvin's friendly facade slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. The child is my blood relation, Alderman. My responsibility now that my brother's gone. Then I hope you find them, Zane replied evenly. But they're not here. Sheriff Davis studied Zane for a long moment. They had history, not all of it pleasant, dating back to a dispute over water rights 2 years prior. The lawman knew Zane wasn't one to back down easily. We'll continue north, Davis finally said. If you see them, you send word immediately. The woman's not in her right mind. Zane nodded noncommittally. The men remounted, Calvin Michaels lingering longest, his eyes scanning the property with obvious suspicion. Strange business, a man living all alone out here, Calvin remarked. No wife, no family. Makes a person wonder. No, it doesn't, Zane replied coldly. Not unless that person's looking to make trouble. Calvin smiled thinly. Good day, Mr. Alderman. Zane watched them ride away, not moving from his position until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he return inside, moving the woodpile to open the cellar door. Willow sat in the darkness, rocking Benjamin gently. She looked up at Zane, questions in her eyes. They're gone, he confirmed. For now. Relief washed over her face as she climbed back into the cabin. The morning light caught the gold flecks in her green eyes, and for a moment, Zane was struck by how young she seemed, how vulnerable, despite her obvious strength. That was Calvin, she said, with the mustache. Zane nodded. Didn't take to him much. A ghost of a smile touched Willow's lips. Good judge of character. Benjamin began to fuss, tiny fists waving in the air. Willow bounced him gently, making soft, shushing sounds. They'll be back, Zane said, moving to stoke the fire. Man like that doesn't give up easily. I know. Willow's voice was steady. I'll leave tonight, like I promised. Head further north, maybe try to reach Canada. Zane watched her with the baby, the practiced way she soothed him, the gentle strength in her hands. The thought of her traveling alone through wilderness with an infant, hunted by men with law on their side, saddle with him. There's another option, he said slowly, surprising himself. You could stay. Willow's head snapped up. Stay. Got a line shack about 3 miles north of here, up in the foothills. Use it during calving season sometimes, but it's empty now. Hidden, unless you know where to look. Zane shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. You could stay there a while. Until we figure something more permanent. Why? Willow asked, echoing her question from the night before. Why would you risk this for us? Zane moved to the window, looking out across his land, the land he'd purchased with blood money from the war, where he'd come to escape the ghosts that haunted him. 6 years of solitude, building something from nothing, speaking to almost no one. Because it's the right thing, he said simply. Then, after a pause, and because I know what it's like to run from something. To have nowhere to go. For the first time since he'd found her, Willow smiled fully, a smile that transformed her face and reached her eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. Thank you, she said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Zane nodded once, already making mental calculations about supplies they'd need, precautions to take. We'll leave at sunset, he said. Best get ready. As he stepped outside to begin preparations, Zane acknowledged the strange feeling in his chest, something like purpose, mixed with a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. Whatever came next, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't let anyone take Willow's baby. Not while he had breath in his body. The lined shack was small but sturdy, built into the side of a hill and sheltered by pines. From the valley below, it was nearly invisible, especially now with spring foliage filling in. Zane had constructed it his second year on the ranch, during a particularly harsh winter when he needed shelter closer to the north pasture. "It's not much," he said, lighting the oil lamp that hung by the door. The single room contained a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. "But it's dry and warm once the fire gets going." Willow stepped inside, Benjamin asleep in her arms after the journey on horseback. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes moved appreciatively around the space. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Safe." Zane busied himself with the stove, avoiding her gaze. "Creek nearby for water. Outhouse around back. I'll bring more supplies tomorrow, proper food, some extra blankets." "I can cook," Willow offered. "And so, I was a seamstress before." She trailed off, gently placing Benjamin on the bed and surrounding him with blankets to keep him from rolling. "Been managing on my own a while now," Zane replied, not unkindly, but wouldn't turn down a decent meal. His own cooking was functional at best, limited to what could be prepared quickly between ranch chores. Willow smiled, and again Zane was struck by how it transformed her face. "Consider it done. Least I can do." Once the fire was crackling in the stove, Zane prepared to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow afternoon," he said, pausing at the door. "Anyone approaches before then, there's a hiding place under the floorboards." And this, he placed his spare revolver on the table. "You know how to use it?" Willow nodded, her expression serious. "James taught me. Said a woman alone should know how to protect herself." "Smart man, your husband." "He was." A shadow crossed her face. "He would have been a good father." Zane shifted uncomfortably and used to the intimacy of such conversation. "Get some rest," he said, tipping his hat before slipping out into the darkness. Riding back to his cabin under the stars, Zane wondered at the sudden complication his life had taken on. For years, he'd avoided entanglements of any kind, preferring the straightforward company of horses and cattle to the complex demands of human relationships. The war had left him with little faith in mankind, and even less in himself. Yet here he was, harboring a fugitive mother and child, lying to the sheriff and plotting against a man with connections. All for a woman he'd known less than 2 days. "Losing your mind, Alderman," he muttered to himself as his cabin came into view. Despite his misgivings, Zane slept better that night than he had in months. The following days established a cautious routine. Zane would complete his morning chores, then ride to the line shack in the afternoon, bringing supplies and news from town. Willow kept the small cabin immaculate, cooked meals that reminded Zane of his mother's cooking, and cared for Benjamin with devoted attention. On his 4th visit, Zane arrived to find Willow outside, hanging freshly washed clothes on a line strung between pine trees. Benjamin lay on a blanket in the dappled shade, cooing at the leaves dancing overhead. The domestic scene struck Zane with unexpected force how natural she looked there, as if she belonged on his land. "You shouldn't be out in the open," he said by way of greeting, dismounting from Thunderhead. Willow glanced up, pushing a strand of hair from her face. The bruised, exhausted woman from the barn had transformed over these few days. With regular meals and rest, color had returned to her cheeks, and she'd repaired her torn dress with neat stitches. "We needed fresh air," she replied, unperturbed by his gruff tone. "And I can see the trail from here. Would have had plenty of time to hide." Zane couldn't argue with her logic, though the thought of her being discovered still sent a chill through him. He'd been to town that morning, ears open for news. Calvin Michaels had taken a room at the hotel indefinitely, making no secret of his search for his disturbed sister-in-law and his endangered nephew. "Brought some things," Zane said, retrieving packages from his saddlebags. "More coffee, flour." Some fabric the general store was selling cheap. He hesitated before pulling out the last item, a small wooden horse he'd carved the night before. And this,
For the boy.
when he's older. Willow accepted the toy, turning it over in her hands. The carving was simple but skillfully done, smooth to the touch with careful attention to detail. "You made this?" she asked. Zane nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Keeps my hands busy in the evenings." "It's beautiful," Willow said softly. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed as she returned the horse, and Zane felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "Coffee ready?" he asked, changing the subject. Inside, the line shack had been transformed by Willow's presence. Wildflowers sat in a tin can on the table, the bed was neatly made, and something savory simmered on the stove. Despite its rustic simplicity, the space now felt like a home. As they sat drinking coffee, Benjamin began to fuss. Willow lifted him from his makeshift cradle, and without thinking, Zane reached out. "May I?" he asked, surprising himself as much as Willow. After a moment's hesitation, she carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Zane adjusted his hold, supporting the tiny head as he'd once seen his sister do with her children, before the war, before everything changed. Benjamin stared up at him with solemn blue eyes, tiny fingers grasping at the air. So small, so utterly defenseless, yet here was this tiny person, complete unto himself, with a life of possibility ahead. "Hello there, little man," Zane said quietly. "You're good with him," Willow observed, watching them with a curious expression. Zane shrugged. "Had a sister once." "3 nephews." "Had?" Willow asked gently. "Cholera," Zane answered. "Eyes still on Benjamin. While I was away fighting. By the time I got word and made it back to Illinois, they were all gone. My sister, her husband, their boys." The words came out matter-of-fact, the grief long since hardened into something he carried silently. "I'm sorry," Willow said, and unlike the empty condolences he'd received years ago, her words held genuine understanding. She knew loss had faced it and kept moving forward, just as he had. "It was a long time ago," Zane replied, carefully handing Benjamin back. "War took a lot from everyone. Is that why you're out here alone?" Willow asked, settling the baby against her shoulder. Zane considered the question, looking out the small window at the mountains beyond. "Partly," he admitted. "When I came back, everything felt
Wrong.
too many people, too many questions, too many ghosts." He rarely spoke of this to anyone. "Came west with what money I had saved. Wanted open space, honest work. Something simple. And now you're harboring fugitives," Willow said with a small smile. "Not so simple anymore." Despite himself, Zane smiled back.
No.
Not so simple. As he prepared to leave that evening, Willow walked him to his horse, Benjamin asleep inside. "I've been thinking," she said, her expression serious. "I can't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, Calvin will expand his search, or someone will spot me. I need to establish that I'm a fit mother, that his claims are false." "That means going to a judge," Zane pointed out. "Proving your case legally." Willow nodded. "There's a circuit judge comes through Helena. James mentioned him once, said he was fair, not easily bought. If I could present my case to him." "Helena's 3 days' ride," Zane said, considering. "And we'd need evidence against Calvin. Witnesses to his character, proof of his gambling debts, his plan to sell Benjamin." "James kept a journal," Willow said. "Detailed everything, including his concerns about Calvin's debts. It's in my bag." She hesitated. "But I can't ask you to get further involved. You've done more than enough already." Zane adjusted Thunderhead's saddle, buying time to think. The sensible course would be to give Willow money, directions to Helena, and wish her luck. Clean break, return to his solitary life. The smart choice. Instead, he found himself saying, I'll ride into town tomorrow. See what I can learn about the circuit judge's schedule, maybe find out who might testify against Calvin. The relief on Willow's face was palpable. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Zane warned. This gets complicated from here. As he mounted Thunderhead, Willow placed a hand on his arm. Be careful in town. Calvin's not a forgiving man. The concern in her voice stirred something in Zane's chest, something long dormant that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. I've handled worse, he assured her, tipping his hat before riding away. Looking back once, he saw her silhouetted against the golden light from the cabin door, a slender figure watching him go. The image stayed with him all the way home. The saloon in Cedar Ridge was doing brisk business when Zane pushed through the swinging doors the following afternoon. He rarely frequented the establishment, preferring the solitude of his ranch to the rowdy atmosphere of town, but information flowed freely here, along with the whiskey. He ordered a drink and positioned himself at the far end of the bar, where he could observe the room while remaining relatively inconspicuous. It didn't take long to spot Calvin Michaels at a corner table, deep in a poker game with several local men, including Thomas Fletcher, who owned the largest mercantile in town. Nursing his whiskey, Zane listened to the conversations flowing around him, piecing together the gossip. Calvin had apparently made quite an impression in the short time he'd been in Cedar Ridge buying drinks, telling stories of his business successes back east, and most importantly, sharing the tragic tale of his poor, mentally unstable sister-in-law who had absconded with his beloved nephew. Shame about that baby, the bartender remarked, refilling Zane's glass unbidden. Sheriffs had men searching all the way to the territorial line. No sign of them yet. Zane grunted noncommittally. You're Alderman, right? The rancher from north of town. The bartender wiped down the counter. Sheriff mentioned he'd checked your place. Said you hadn't seen them. That's right, Zane replied evenly, taking another sip of whiskey. Funny thing, the bartender continued, lowering his voice. Michaels over there keeps asking questions about you. What kind of man you are, if you've got family, how long you've been here. Curious sort. Zane's hand tightened imperceptibly around his glass. That's so. Figured you should know, the bartender shrugged. Man starts asking about another man's business, usually means trouble brewing. Appreciated, Zane said, sliding an extra coin across the bar. At that moment, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Davis entered, scanning the room before making his way to Calvin's table. The conversation between them was brief but intense, with Calvin's expression darkening before he threw down his cards and followed the sheriff outside. Zane waited a few minutes before casually making his way to the bar's front window. Across the street, he could see Calvin and the sheriff in heated discussion with a man he recognized as Joe Turner, who ran the livery stable on the edge of town. What's got them riled up? Zane asked the bartender, who had joined him at the window. Probably Turner's news, the man replied. Heard him telling folks this morning he sold a horse to a woman matching the description of Michael's sister-in-law about a week ago. Woman with a baby, paid cash, headed north. Zane's blood ran cold. That right?
Yep.
Sheriff's been organizing search parties all day. Heading out at first light tomorrow to sweep north toward the territorial border. Zane downed the rest of his whiskey, mind racing. He hadn't considered that someone might have seen Willow before she reached his property. If search parties were combing the countryside, the line shack wouldn't stay hidden for long. Say, the bartender continued, didn't your place get checked already? Might want to keep an eye out, case they decide to take another look. Thanks for the warning, Zane said, placing his empty glass on the bar. Think I'll head back now. Got stock to tend to. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, Zane nearly collided with Calvin Michaels, who was returning to the saloon. The smaller man steadied himself, a too-wide smile spreading across his face. Mr. Alderman. Just the man I wanted to see. Zane nodded curtly. Michaels. I was hoping we might have a word, Calvin said, gesturing back toward the saloon. Buy you a drink? Was just leaving, Zane replied, moving to step around him. Calvin's hand shot out, gripping Zane's arm with surprising strength. "Insist," he said, the smile never reaching his eyes. "Won't take but a moment of your time." Aware of the sheriff watching from across the street, Zane reluctantly allowed himself to be steered back into the saloon, to a quiet corner table. "Whiskey for my friend," Calvin called to the bartender, before turning his attention fully to Zane. "I believe we got off on the wrong foot the other day, Mr. Alderman." "Didn't realize we were trying to be friends," Zane replied coolly. Calvin chuckled. "Direct man. I respect that." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I understand how this might appear. A stranger comes to town, looking for a woman and child, making accusations about her mental state. Naturally, a decent man like yourself would be protective." Zane said nothing, face impassive. "But I assure you, my only concern is for my nephew's welfare," Calvin continued smoothly. "My poor brother, God rest his soul, would expect nothing less of me than to ensure his son is properly provided for. And my sister-in-law, Willow. Well, grief affects people differently. The doctor in Virginia City was quite concerned about her state of mind." "Sounds like a family matter," Zane observed. "Not sure what it has to do with me." Calvin's smile tightened fractionally. "Indeed. Yet I can't help noticing you've been asking questions around town. About the circuit judge's schedule."
About me.
He paused, watching Zane carefully, almost as if you have some personal interest in the matter. The whiskeys arrived, and Zane used the interruption to consider his response. Calvin was fishing he realized had no real evidence, just suspicions. "Been meaning to file some paperwork with a judge myself," Zane said after taking a deliberate sip. "Water rights dispute with a neighbor. Heard he'd be coming through soon." "Is that so?" Calvin didn't look convinced. "Well, perhaps I misunderstood. Though I find it interesting that you've suddenly developed business in town, when by all accounts you've been something of a hermit these past years." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Zane set down his glass, meeting Calvin's gaze directly. "Mr. Michaels," he said quietly, "I sympathize with your situation.
Truly.
But I've told the sheriff all I know, which is nothing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got cattle that need tending." As Zane stood to leave, Calvin made one final observation. "Interesting thing about cattle ranching, Mr. Alderman. One man can only watch so much territory. Easy for things or people to slip through unnoticed." Zane paused, the implied threat clear. "Careful, Michaels. Man could take that as a warning against trespassing on private property." "Just an observation," Calvin replied, raising his glass in mock salute. "Safe ride home." Outside, Zane mounted Thunderhead with a sense of urgency he was careful not to display. Calvin's suspicions, combined with the news of search parties heading north at dawn, meant their situation had become far more precarious. They needed to move tonight. Instead of taking the main road, Zane circled wide around town, using game trails and dry creek beds to reach the line shack. Dusk was falling by the time he arrived, the small cabin glowing with lamplight in the gathering darkness. Willow opened the door at his approach, Benjamin on her hip. One look at Zane's expression told her something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, stepping back to let him enter. "They're organizing search parties," Zane said, without preamble. "Someone at the livery remembered selling you a horse. They're combing north starting tomorrow." He began gathering items from the shelves. "We need to leave."
Now.
Willow paled but remained composed, immediately moving to collect her few belongings. "Where will we go?" "South," Zane decided. "They'll expect you to continue north toward Canada. I've got another property old mining claim near the mountains. Cabin's rough, but it's remote. We can hide there while we figure out our next move." "You're coming with us?" Willow asked, pausing in her packing. Zane hadn't realized until that moment that he'd included himself in their flight. The sensible thing would be to point them in the right direction and return to his ranch, maintain his innocence. Calvin suspects something, he said instead. Better if I'm not around to question for a few days. Make it look like I've gone to the spring cattle auction in Fort Benton. The relief in Willow's eyes made something twist in his chest. Thank you, she said simply. They worked quickly, packing only essentials. Zane saddled Willow's horse, securing their supplies while she bundled Benjamin warmly against the night air. Within 30 minutes, they were ready to depart. Stay close, Zane instructed as they set off, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. We'll ride through the night, reach the cabin by morning. The journey was tense, with frequent stops to listen for pursuers. Benjamin, remarkably, stayed quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Willow rode confidently despite her obvious exhaustion, one arm cradling her son against her chest, the other handling the reins with practiced ease. As they picked their way through a moonlit valley, Zane found himself watching the determination in her profile, the gentle way she murmured reassurances to Benjamin, the strength evident in every line of her body. Whatever Calvin had said about her mental state was clearly false. This was a woman of extraordinary resilience, fighting with everything she had to protect her child. Why would Calvin want to sell your son? Zane asked during a brief rest to water the horses. Seems an extreme measure, even for a man with gambling debts. Willow's face hardened in the moonlight. It's not just the money, though that's part of it. Calvin always James resented that their father left the family business to both of them equally, though Calvin was older. When James decided to come west instead of staying to run the business with Calvin, it created a rift. She adjusted Benjamin's blanket before continuing. When James died, he left everything to me and Benjamin, including his share of the family business back east. Calvin can't touch it while I'm alive and Benjamin is under my care. But if I were declared unfit, and he became Benjamin's guardian, he'd control the boy's inheritance, Zane finished, understanding dawning. And selling Benjamin to another family would eliminate the heir entirely, leaving Calvin as James's only living relative. Willow nodded grimly. The business is worth far more than the $800 he'd get for Benjamin. This was never about being a concerned uncle. The pieces clicked into place for Zane. Calvin's determination, his resources, his willingness to pursue them across the territory. This wasn't a simple family dispute. It was calculated greed, with a child's future as the prize. We need to reach that judge, Zane said, helping Willow remount. With your husband's journal and what we know about Calvin's plan, we might have enough to stop him. And if we don't? Willow asked, the question hanging in the pre-dawn air. Zane checked his revolvers before mounting Thunderhead. Then we keep running. As long as it takes. The simple declaration not you, hung between them as they continued their journey south, the first light of dawn breaking over the distant mountains. The abandoned mining cabin perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow valley, its weathered exterior blending into the surrounding landscape. Zane had purchased the claim 3 years earlier when the original owner gave up on finding gold and decided to try his luck in California. While the mine itself had yielded little of value, the property provided excellent grazing for summer pasture and a strategic vantage point from which to observe the surrounding territory. It's not much, Zane said as they approached, echoing his words from the lined shack. But it's defensible. Willow, exhausted from the night's journey, merely nodded, Benjamin asleep in her arms. The child had been remarkably resilient throughout their flight, fussing only briefly when hungry or needing changing. Inside, the cabin was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Zane immediately set about starting a fire, while Willow settled Benjamin on the bed, surrounding him with blankets. You should rest, Zane said, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. I'll keep watch. For once, Willow didn't argue, her exhaustion evident as she curled beside her son on the bed. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Zane moved to the cabin's single window, surveying the valley below. They'd covered their tracks well, taking a circuitous route that would confuse any pursuers, but he harbored no illusions about the determination of Calvin Michaels. The man wouldn't give up easily, especially with so much at stake. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Zane found himself studying Willow's sleeping form, the protective way she curled around Benjamin, even in sleep, the softening of her features as tension eased from her body. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth he wasn't ready to name. He turned back to the window, forcing his attention to the landscape beyond. They were safe for now, but they needed a plan. The circuit judge wouldn't reach Helena for another 2 weeks, according to what he'd overheard in town. Until then, they needed to remain hidden while gathering enough evidence to counter Calvin's claims. Zane had connections in Helena, an old war comrade who'd become a lawyer, a man who owed him a favor. Perhaps between James's journal and whatever testimony they could secure, they might build a case strong enough to convince the judge of Willow's fitness as a mother and Calvin's true motives. The alternative, continuing to run, perhaps all the way to Canada or beyond, held little appeal. Zane had built his life here, invested years of hard work into his ranch. And Willow deserved better than a fugitive's existence, always looking over her shoulder, raising her son in fear. No, they would make their stand. Together. The thought should have unsettled him more than it did. Willow woke to the smell of coffee and something savory cooking. For a moment, disoriented by exhaustion, she couldn't place her surroundings. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back: the hasty departure, the tense journey through darkness, the arrival at this remote cabin. Benjamin still slept beside her, tiny fists curled above his head. She brushed a gentle finger over his cheek, marveling as always at his perfect features, so like his father's. "There's food, if you're hungry." Zane's voice came from the fireplace, where he tended a pot hanging over the flames. Willow sat up, pushing hair from her face. "How long did I sleep?" "Most of the day," Zane replied. "It's nearly sunset." She moved to join him by the fire, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. The cabin looked different in daylight, small but sturdier than it had appeared in the pre-dawn hours, with a certain rustic charm despite its simplicity. "No sign of pursuit?" she asked, sipping the strong, hot coffee gratefully. Zane shook his head. "Nothing. But we should remain cautious. Calvin's not the type to give up easily." "No," Willow agreed grimly. "He isn't." Zane ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to her, a simple mixture of dried beef, beans, and what looked like wild onions. "It's not fancy," he apologized. "It's wonderful," Willow assured him after the first bite, suddenly aware of her hunger. "Thank you for all of this." Zane busied himself with his own bowl, avoiding her gaze. "Been thinking about our next steps," he said. "Judge won't be in Helena for 2 weeks. We need to stay hidden until then, but also build our case." Willow nodded, reaching for the saddlebag that contained James's journal. "This will help, but you're right, we need more. Evidence of Calvin's gambling debts, witnesses to his character, proof of his plan to sell Benjamin." "I know someone in Helena," Zane said. "Former soldier, now a lawyer. Man named Harrison Reed. If anyone can help us prepare for the judge, it's him." "Can he be trusted?" Willow asked, the wariness of recent events making her cautious of any new connection. "With my life," Zane answered simply. "Saved us during the war. He's a good man." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful here," Willow observed, looking out the small window. "It is," Zane agreed, following her gaze. "That's why I stayed. After the war, everything back east felt crowded, needed space to breathe again." Willow studied him in the firelight, the strong profile, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if always prepared for some unseen threat. She'd known him less than a week, yet in that short time, he'd risked everything to help her and Benjamin. Such men were rare in her experience. "James would have liked you," she said suddenly. "He valued honesty above all else. Said you could tell a man's character by how he acted when no one was watching." Zane looked up, meeting her gaze across the fire. "Sounds like a good man." He was, Willow confirmed. Not perfect stubborn, sometimes too trusting, but good. She hesitated. "I loved him very much." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zane said quietly. Willow nodded her thanks, turning the wedding band she still wore. "Some days it doesn't seem real, that he's gone. Other days—" She glanced at Benjamin, still sleeping peacefully. "Other days I see him in every movement Benjamin makes, and it hurts all over again." Zane was silent for a long moment. "After my sister died, he finally said, 'I couldn't look at children for months. Reminded me too much of her boys. What they'd never become.'" He stared into the fire. "Time doesn't heal it. Not really. Just teaches you to carry it differently." The simple honesty of his words touched Willow deeply. Here was someone who understood grief, not as something to overcome, but as something to incorporate into one's being, a reshaping of the soul. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding. For not telling me it will get better, or that everything happens for a reason." A ghost of a smile touched Zane's lips. "Never much cared for those sentiments myself." Benjamin's cry interrupted the moment. Willow moved to the bed, lifting him into her arms. "Someone's hungry," she said, her tone shifting to the gentle one she reserved for her son. Zane stood, grabbing his hat from the table. "I'll check the perimeter," he said, heading for the door. "Make sure we're still secure." Willow recognized the gesture for what it was, offering her privacy to feed Benjamin, and appreciated the consideration. As she settled by the fire to nurse her son, she found herself watching the door through which Zane had disappeared, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been desperate and alone, certain that Calvin would succeed in taking Benjamin from her. Now, against all odds, she had found an ally, someone willing to risk everything to help them. For the first time since James's death, Willow felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The days at the mining cabin fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings began with Zane checking the surrounding area before returning to help prepare a simple breakfast. Willow kept the cabin tidy and cared for Benjamin, while also working on cataloging the evidence in James's journal: dates, names, specific incidents that demonstrated Calvin's true character and intentions. Zane spent part of each day hunting or fishing to supplement their supplies, teaching Willow which local plants were edible, which medicinal. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, planning their approach to the judge, discussing contingencies should things go wrong. On their 5th day at the cabin, Zane returned from hunting with a young deer slung across Thunderhead's back. As he set about dressing the animal at a distance from the cabin, Willow joined him, Benjamin secured in a sling across her chest. "Need an extra pair of hands?" she offered. Zane glanced up, knife pausing mid-cut. "You know how to dress game?" "James taught me," Willow replied with a small smile. "Said a frontier wife should know how to handle herself." She set Benjamin on a blanket in the shade nearby, where he could watch the clouds drifting overhead. He'd be about 6 months old now if. Her voice trailed off, and Zane nodded in understanding. The grief was still raw, still present in everyday moments. "Here," he said, handing her a smaller knife. "You take that side." They worked together efficiently, Willow's hands as steady and capable as Zane had suspected they would be. There was something comforting about the shared task, the practical work that would sustain them in the days ahead. "We should smoke some of this," Willow suggested as they finished. "It'll keep longer." Zane nodded. "Good thinking. There's a small smokehouse behind the cabin. Previous owner built it." As they carried the meat back toward the cabin, Benjamin began to fuss. Willow paused to pick him up, balancing him on one hip while still carrying her portion of the dressed venison. "Let me," Zane said, setting down his load and reaching for the baby. To his surprise, Benjamin went to him willingly, tiny hands immediately grasping at his beard. The child had become increasingly comfortable with Zane over the past days, watching him with solemn curiosity that occasionally broke into delighted smiles. "He likes you," Willow observed as they continued toward the cabin. "Seems the feeling's mutual," Zane admitted, adjusting Benjamin more securely against his chest. The weight of the child felt right somehow, natural in a way he hadn't expected. Later, as Willow prepared strips of venison for smoking, she glanced over to where Zane sat by the fire, whittling another small wooden toy while Benjamin watched from his lap, fascinated by the movement of the knife and the emerging shape. The scene struck her with unexpected force, domestic, peaceful, almost like a family. The thought brought both comfort and confusion. James had been gone only 3 months, the wound of his loss still fresh. Yet here she was, finding solace in the presence of another man, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering protection had become central to her and Benjamin's survival. Was it merely gratitude she felt? Or something more complicated? Zane looked up, catching her gaze. Something passed between them, unspoken, undefined, but undeniably present. Then Benjamin grabbed at the wood in Zane's hands, breaking the moment with his happy babbling. "Demanding little fellow," Zane commented with a rare smile. "Like his father," Willow replied, returning to her task with renewed focus. That night, after Benjamin was asleep and the cabin quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Zane unfolded a map on the table between them. "We should leave for Helena in 3 days," he said, tracing the route with his finger. "Takes us through here, avoiding the main roads. Should reach Harrison's place by nightfall the day before the judge arrives." Willow studied the map, noting the careful planning evident in Zane's chosen route. "What about Calvin? He'll have men watching the town, expecting us." "Harrison's house is on the outskirts," Zane explained. "We can approach from the east, avoid being seen. And he'll have prepared the necessary legal documents ahead of our arrival." Willow nodded, trusting his judgment. Over these days together, she'd come to recognize Zane's methodical nature, his attention to detail, his consideration of all possibilities. These were the qualities that had likely kept him alive during the war, and now they would help protect her and Benjamin. "What happens after?" she asked quietly. "If the judge rules in our favor?" Zane looked up, brow furrowed. "Calvin would no longer have legal claim to Benjamin. You'd be free to go wherever you choose." "And if we lose?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Zane's jaw tightened, his hand flat against the map. "We won't," he said with quiet certainty. "But if somehow we did, there's Canada. Or California. Places beyond Calvin's reach." "We," Willow repeated softly. "You keep saying we." Zane held her gaze across the table, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual reserve.
Ido.
In that simple acknowledgement lay a wealth of meaning, a commitment not easily made by a man who had spent years cultivating solitude. Willow reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Zane turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. "No need for thanks between us," he replied quietly. They remained that way for a long moment, connected by touch and shared purpose, the fire casting flickering shadows across their joined hands. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer sun. Zane rose early as always, checking the perimeter before starting coffee over the rekindled fire. The routine had become comfortable, almost domestic, a strange thought for a man who had lived alone for so long. He was slicing bread when a movement outside the window caught his eye. Freezing mid-motion, Zane peered through the grimy glass, heart suddenly pounding. They're a flash of color among the pines, too deliberate to be wildlife. In 3 quick strides, he was at Willow's side, hand gently covering her mouth as she startled awake. He placed a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the window. Understanding dawned in her eyes immediately. She nodded once, already reaching for Benjamin, who still slept beside her. "Someone's out there," Zane whispered, retrieving his rifle from beside the door. "At least one person, possibly more. Get Benjamin ready to move." Willow worked quickly and silently, wrapping Benjamin in a blanket while Zane gathered essential supplies: water, jerky, ammunition. They had discussed this contingency, had a plan ready. "The mine shaft," Zane murmured, referring to the old tunnel behind the cabin that led deep into the hillside. "Remember the route we discussed?" Willow nodded, securing Benjamin in the sling across her chest. "The passage leads through to the other side of the ridge. We follow the creek south." "I'll create a diversion," Zane said, checking his revolvers. "Meet you at the agreed location by nightfall." Fear flashed across Willow's face. "Zane, I'll be fine," he assured her, voice low but firm. "Go now, while they're still approaching. Stay in the tree line." Willow hesitated only a moment before pressing something into his hand: James's wedding ring, which she'd kept on a cord around her neck. "For luck," she whispered. Then, with a swiftness that surprised him, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his brief but unmistakable. Before he could respond, she was gone, slipping through the back door with Benjamin held close. Zane stood momentarily frozen, the unexpected kiss leaving him oddly disoriented. Then training took over. He pocketed the ring, positioned himself by the window, and settled into wait. They appeared at the edge of the clearing moments later: 4 men on horseback, rifles ready. Zane recognized Sheriff Davis and Calvin Michaels immediately. The other 2 were strangers, though their posture suggested hired guns rather than lawmen. "Alderman," Sheriff Davis called out. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceable-like, and we can discuss this situation." Zane remained silent, watching through a crack in the shutters as the men spread out, surrounding the cabin. Calvin's face was visible now, a mask of controlled fury as he scanned the area, clearly looking for signs of Willow and Benjamin. "Your property's been searched, Alderman," Davis continued. "Found evidence of a woman and child at your line shack. Harboring fugitives is a serious offense." Still Zane waited, counting seconds in his head, giving Willow time to reach the mine entrance and begin her journey through the passage. He needed to hold their attention for at least 20 minutes to ensure she had sufficient head start. "Enough of this," Calvin called impatiently.
He's stalling.
"Riker, Jenkins, check the back. See if the woman's still inside." The 2 unknown men dismounted, moving cautiously toward the rear of the cabin. It was time. Zane fired a warning shot into the air, causing all 4 men to dive for cover. "That's far enough," he called out. "Next one won't be a warning." Sheriff Davis raised his hands placatingly. "Now, Alderman, don't make this worse than it already is. We just want the woman and child. You turn them over, maybe the judge goes easy on you." "There's no one here but me," Zane replied evenly. "And I don't take kindly to armed men surrounding my property." Calvin Michaels moved forward, ignoring the sheriff's gesture to stay back. "We know she's with you, Alderman. The woman is mentally unstable, a danger to herself and my nephew. As the child's only living male relative, it's my duty to ensure his safety." "Funny," Zane remarked, "how a concerned uncle would sell his own nephew for cash." Calvin froze, his expression shifting from righteousness to calculation. "I don't know what lies she's told you." "Not lies," Zane interrupted. "Evidence. Her husband's journal detailing your gambling debts, your scheme to control the family business through Benjamin. Documented proof that you plan to sell the boy to cover your losses." The color drained from Calvin's face, replaced by a cold fury. "Sheriff," he snapped, "this man is clearly delusional. Arrest him and search the property. Davis hesitated, glancing between Calvin and the cabin. Now, Mr. Michaels, we need to proceed according to the law. I'm paying you to find my nephew, Calvin hissed, loud enough for Zane to hear.
Do your job.
The sheriff's expression hardened at the public admission of bribery. Mr. Michaels, perhaps you should let me handle this. Calvin's response was to draw his own revolver, aiming it directly at the cabin. Alderman, you have 1 minute to send out my sister-in-law and the boy, or we're coming and shooting. Calvin, the sheriff protested, but the smaller man was beyond reason now, desperation evident in every line of his body. Zane calculated his options. 15 minutes had passed, not enough time for Willow to have cleared the passage entirely, but perhaps enough of a head start if he continued to delay them. She's not here, Michaels, he called out. Left yesterday for Helena. Taking her case directly to the circuit judge. You might want to prepare your explanation about selling your nephew. Calvin's face contorted with rage. You're lying. Am I? Zane countered calmly. Seems you're the one with something to hide. How much did you offer the doctor to declare her unfit? How many people in Virginia City know about your plan to sell Benjamin to that childless couple from Boston? Calvin fired wildly, the bullet splintering the wood beside the window. Jenkins. Riker. Burn him out. The sheriff moved then, grabbing Calvin's arm. That's enough. This is still my jurisdiction, and I won't have murder on my hands. While the men argued, Zane seized his opportunity. Slipping through the back door, he made his way silently to where Thunderhead was tethered in a small copse of trees. The horse, trained to remain quiet, didn't make a sound as Zane mounted. The first sign the men had of his escape was the thunder of hooves as Zane broke from the tree line, riding hard in the opposite direction from where Willow had gone. There he goes, someone shouted. Gunfire erupted behind him, bullets whizzing past as Zane kept low in the saddle, urging Thunderhead to greater speed. He glanced back once to see all 4 men mounting, Calvin in the lead, their attention now fully on him rather than searching the property. Good. Let them chase him across the territory if necessary. Every mile they pursued him was another mile of safety for Willow and Benjamin. Zane knew these mountains better than any of them. He would lead them on a chase, lose them in the high country, then circle back to meet Willow at their rendezvous point. The plan was solid, tested by years of evading both Union and Confederate patrols during the war. What he hadn't counted on was the bullet that suddenly burned across his side, nearly unseating him as Thunderhead leaped a fallen log. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Zane pressed on, one hand clutching the wound, the other tight on the reins. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as he navigated increasingly difficult terrain, forcing his pursuers to slow or risk their horses. Blood seeped through his fingers, warm against his side, but the wound didn't feel deep, a graze rather than a direct hit. He would make it. He had to. Willow and Benjamin were counting on him. The image of her face flashed in his mind, the determination in her eyes, the gentle way she held her son, the unexpected softness of her lips against his in that brief moment before she disappeared. Whatever happened next, Zane knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever necessary to protect them both. For the first time in years, he had someone worth fighting for. Willow moved through the mine passage as quickly as she dared, one hand steadying Benjamin in his sling, the other holding the small lantern Zane had prepared for exactly this purpose. The tunnel was low in places, forcing her to duck, and the air grew increasingly stale the deeper she went. Benjamin, remarkably, remained quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Occasionally, he would look up at her with solemn eyes, tiny fingers grasping at her collar. "We're almost there, little one," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Zane will meet us soon." The thought of Zane facing Calvin and his men alone twisted her stomach with fear. She had come to rely on his quiet strength, his steady presence. More than that, though she scarcely dared admit it even to herself, she had begun to care for him in ways that went beyond mere gratitude. The kiss had been impulsive, born of fear, and something deeper that had been growing between them during their days together. What had started as desperate necessity, a stranger offering shelter, had evolved into something far more complex. The passage began to lighten ahead, and soon Willow emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a small valley. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, after the chill of the tunnel. She paused, orienting herself according to Zane's instructions. The creek lay below, winding south through a stand of aspen trees. Their meeting place, an abandoned trapper's cabin, was several miles downstream. Taking a deep breath, Willow began her descent, careful on the loose shale. Behind her, faintly, came the sound of gunfire from the direction of the mining cabin. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to continue. Zane had given her clear instructions: keep moving, reach the rendezvous point, wait no more than 2 days. If he didn't appear by then. She refused to complete the thought. He would come. He had to. The journey through the valley was arduous, but uneventful. Benjamin grew hungry mid-afternoon, forcing Willow to stop and nurse him in the shelter of a rocky outcrop. As he fed, she found herself studying his features, James's nose, her own eyes, and wondering about his future. Would they succeed in their plan? Would Calvin eventually give up his pursuit? Could she and Benjamin ever truly be safe? And what of Zane? The man who had risked everything to help them, who had shown such unexpected gentleness with Benjamin, whose rare smiles had begun to warm something long cold inside her. These questions accompanied her as she continued south, following the creek as instructed. Dusk was falling when she finally spotted the trapper's cabin, little more than a lean-to against a large boulder, but shelter nonetheless. Inside, she found the supplies Zane had cached earlier in the week: blankets, jerky, water, matches. Always thinking ahead, always planning for contingencies. The realization of how much care he had taken in preparing for their safety brought tears to her eyes for the first time that day. Willow built a small, smokeless fire as Zane had taught her, fed Benjamin again, and settled him to sleep wrapped in one of the blankets. Only then did she allow herself to truly feel the fear she'd been holding at bay all day. Where was Zane now? Had he escaped Calvin and the sheriff? Was he injured or worse? The night grew cold around the small cabin, but Willow didn't sleep. She sat in the doorway, rifle across her lap as Zane had shown her, watching the moonlit valley for any sign of approach, friend or foe. It was nearly dawn when she heard the soft nickering of a horse, moving slowly through the trees below. Willow raised the rifle, heart pounding as she strained to see in the pre-dawn light. A figure emerged from the shadows, leading rather than riding a horse. The silhouette was unmistakable: Zane's broad shoulders, his distinctive hat. But something was wrong. He moved stiffly, one arm pressed against his side. Willow set down the rifle and ran to meet him, relief warring with concern as she drew closer and saw the dark stains spreading across his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, moving to support him as he stumbled slightly. "Just a graze," Zane assured her, though the pallor of his face belied his words. "Calvin's not a very good shot, thankfully." "Come inside," Willow urged, helping him toward the cabin. "I need to look at that wound." Inside, by the light of the rekindled fire, the injury appeared worse than Zane had described: a deep furrow along his ribs, still seeping blood despite the makeshift bandage he'd applied. "You need stitches," Willow said, already reaching for the medical supplies in their pack. Zane nodded tiredly, leaning back against the cabin wall. "How's Benjamin?" "Fine," Willow replied, gathering what she needed. "Slept through most of the journey. He's becoming quite the little traveler." A ghost of a smile touched Zane's lips. "Good boy." Willow worked quickly, cleaning the wound with whiskey from their supplies, threading a needle with steady hands. "This will hurt," she warned. "Not my first bullet wound," Zane replied grimly. Just do what needs doing. He remained stoically silent as she stitched the gash closed, only the tightening around his eyes betraying his pain. Willow worked methodically, her fingers gentle but sure. When she finally tied off the last stitch and covered the wound with a clean bandage, Zane released a long breath. "Thank you," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "What happened after we separated?" Willow asked, washing blood from her hands with precious water. Zane leaned his head back, eyes closing briefly. Led them north into the high country. Lost them near the pass when night fell. Doubled back here. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. "They know we're heading for the judge." Calvin was desperate. "Ordered the sheriff to burn me out of the cabin." Willow paled. "My God." "Sheriff refused," Zane continued. "Man may be corrupt, but he draws the line at murder, apparently. There was an argument. That's when I made my escape." "And now?" Willow asked, glancing toward the doorway, as if expecting pursuers to peer at any moment. "They'll regroup, keep searching," Zane said. "But we've bought time. Need to rest here today. Continue to Helena tomorrow night." Willow nodded, understanding the necessity, despite her desire to put more distance between them and Calvin. Zane needed rest to recover his strength, and traveling by night would reduce the risk of being spotted. "You should sleep," she said, helping him to a more comfortable position on the blankets. "I'll keep watch." Zane caught her hand as she moved away. "Willow," he said quietly, "before you left." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Willow felt heat rise to her cheeks, remembering the impulsive kiss. "I'm sorry if I don't be," Zane interrupted, his hand tightening around hers. "Not unless you regret it." Their eyes met in the dim light of the cabin, something unspoken passing between them. Willow shook her head slowly. "I don't regret it," she whispered. Zane's expression softened, the usual guardedness giving way to something warmer. "Good," he said simply. Then, fatigue overtaking him, his eyes drifted closed, his hand still holding hers. Willow remained beside him until his breathing deepened with sleep. Only then did she gently withdraw her hand and move to check on Benjamin, who still slept peacefully in his makeshift bed. Looking between the sleeping man and her son, Willow felt a strange sense of rightness despite their precarious situation. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The realization brought both comfort and a flutter of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, yes, but also the first stirrings of feelings she had thought lost with James's death. It should have frightened her, this unexpected emotional complication in the midst of their struggle for survival. Instead, it filled her with a quiet resolve. They would reach the judge. They would defeat Calvin. And then they would see what might grow from the seeds planted during these desperate days together. Helena in 1876 was a city in transition, still rough around the edges from its gold rush origins, but increasingly civilized as merchants, bankers, and government officials established permanent residence. The territorial capital boasted proper streets, substantial buildings, and the trappings of Eastern refinement alongside saloons and gambling halls that catered to miners and cowboys. Zane, Willow, and Benjamin reached the outskirts shortly after midnight, having traveled cross-country to avoid the main roads where Calvin might have posted watchers. The journey had been slow, hampered by Zane's injury, which despite Willow's careful tending had developed a low fever by the second day. "Harrison's place is just ahead," Zane said, voice strained with the effort of remaining upright in the saddle. "White house with green shutters. End of this street." Willow nodded, Benjamin sleeping against her chest in a sling. The child had been remarkably resilient throughout their journey, adapting to the irregular schedule and constant movement with surprising ease. The house, when they reached it, was dark save for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window, the signal Harrison had promised to leave if all was secure. Zane dismounted stiffly, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches, and helped Willow down from her horse. Before they could approach the door, it opened, revealing a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and spectacles. He stepped out quickly, closing the door behind him. "Cutting it close, Alderman," he said in a low voice, eyeing Zane's condition with concern. "Judge Harmon arrives tomorrow noon." "Had some complications," Zane replied grimly. "Harrison Reed, meet Willow Michaels and her son Benjamin." Harrison bowed slightly to Willow, his expression softening as he noticed the sleeping child.
Madam.
"Let's get you inside before anyone notices." Town's crawling with strangers asking questions about a woman and baby. The interior of the house was warmly lit and comfortably furnished, clearly the home of a man of some means and education. Harrison led them through to a small sitting room at the back, where a fire burned low in the grate. "My housekeeper prepared the guest rooms upstairs," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "She's discreet. No one will know you're here." "Thank you," Willow said, carefully transferring Benjamin to the small settee without waking him. "We appreciate your help, Mr. Reed." "Harrison, please," he replied, already examining Zane with a practiced eye. "You need a doctor, old friend." Zane shook his head. "No doctors. Can't risk word getting out." Harrison frowned, but didn't argue. "At least let me look at that wound. Army surgeon taught me a thing or two during the war." While Harrison tended to Zane's injury, Willow paced the small room, cradling Benjamin, who had awakened and begun to fuss. The events of the past weeks had left her exhausted, but with their goals so close, she found herself unable to relax. "You've prepared the legal documents?" Zane asked as Harrison applied a fresh bandage. "Everything's ready," Harrison confirmed. "Petition for formal guardianship of Benjamin, affidavit detailing Calvin's threats and plans to sell the child, supporting evidence from James's journal." He glanced at Willow. "It's a strong case, Mrs. Michaels. Judge Harmon is known for his fairness, particularly in matters concerning children's welfare." "And Calvin?" Zane pressed. "Any sign of him in town?" Harrison's expression darkened. "Arrived yesterday with Sheriff Davis and 2 hired guns. They've been asking questions all over town, offering rewards for information." He adjusted his spectacles. "I've also heard rumors that Calvin has been meeting with Judge Harmon's clerk, possibly attempting to influence the proceedings before they begin." Willow's hands tightened around Benjamin. "He's trying to bribe the judge?" "Unlikely to succeed," Harrison assured her. "Harmon's reputation for integrity is well established. But it demonstrates Calvin's desperation." Zane stood carefully, testing his strength. The fresh bandage had helped, but the fever remained, evident in the brightness of his eyes and the flush across his cheekbones. "We should rest while we can," he said. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Harrison nodded agreement. "I'll show you to your rooms. The hearing is scheduled for 2 o'clock at the courthouse. I'll accompany you there myself. There's a private entrance we can use to avoid being seen." As they followed Harrison upstairs, Willow reached for Zane's hand, squeezing it gently in silent support. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, despite the danger that still surrounded them, she felt a strange calm. They had made it this far together. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it the same way. Morning brought rain, a steady, soaking downpour that turned Helena's streets to mud and shrouded the mountains in mist. Willow stood at the window of her assigned bedroom, watching water stream down the glass while Benjamin nursed contentedly. A soft knock at the door preceded Zane's entrance. He looked better this morning, still pale, but the fever had broken overnight, and his movements were less stiff. "How are you feeling?" Willow asked, adjusting her clothing as Benjamin finished feeding. "Well enough," Zane replied, moving to join her at the window. "Harrison's housekeeper makes a decent tonic." Willow studied his profile in the gray morning light, the strong jaw now covered with several days' growth of beard, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by recent strain, the quiet determination that had become so familiar. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. For everything you've risked, everything you've sacrificed. Zane turned to her, something vulnerable in his expression. No sacrifice, he said simply. Not for you. For Benjamin. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Willow shifted Benjamin to her shoulder, freeing one hand to touch Zane's cheek gently. When this is over, she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the feelings that had grown between them during their shared ordeal. Zane covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss against her palm. When this is over, he echoed, we'll have time to talk, to decide. The moment was interrupted by Harrison's voice calling from downstairs, announcing that breakfast was ready. Zane stepped back, but his eyes held a promise that made Willow's heart beat faster. Downstairs, over plates of eggs and bacon, Harrison outlined the plan for the day. Judge Harmon will hear your case in chambers rather than open court, a courtesy I requested given the sensitive nature of the situation. We'll enter through the rear of the courthouse at 1:30, avoiding the main entrance where Calvin might have men watching. What about Calvin himself? Zane asked, pushing food around his plate with little appetite. He'll be at the hearing. Unavoidable, Harrison acknowledged. But the judge's chambers will be secure, with a bailiff present. And I've arranged for 2 friends, former soldiers, men I trust to accompany us as additional protection. Willow listened carefully, Benjamin dozing in her arms. The legal proceedings seemed straightforward enough. Present their evidence, allow the judge to question her regarding her fitness as a mother, counter any claims Calvin might make about her mental state. What concerns me, Harrison continued, is what happens after the hearing, regardless of the outcome. If Calvin is desperate enough to attempt bribing a judge, he may not accept an unfavorable ruling peacefully. We've considered that, Zane said, exchanging glances with Willow. If the judge rules in our favor, we'll need to leave Helena immediately, return to my property, gather essentials, then possibly head west to Oregon Territory until things settle. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Wise precaution. I have contacts in Portland who could help you establish yourselves there if necessary. The conversation continued, discussing contingencies and legal details, but Willow found her attention drifting to the future. Harrison and Zane discussed so matter-of-factly a future that increasingly seemed to include both of them together. The realization should have been more jarring. Instead, it felt like the natural progression of what had begun that night in Zane's barn. By early afternoon, the rain had slackened to a drizzle as they prepared to leave for the courthouse. Willow dressed in clean clothes. Harrison's housekeeper had provided a simple blue dress that was more presentable than her travel-worn attire. She brushed her hair until it shone, pinning it carefully at the nape of her neck. Benjamin was changed and fed, dressed in a clean gown, peaceful in his mother's arms. Zane, too, had made efforts with his appearance, freshly shaved, hair trimmed, wearing a borrowed suit that was slightly too large for his frame. When he entered the sitting room where Willow waited, she was struck by the transformation. Without the trail dust and rugged clothing, he looked almost like a different man, still imposing, but with a quiet dignity that spoke of his upbringing before the war changed everything. You look beautiful, he said simply, his eyes taking in her appearance. As do you, Willow replied with a small smile. Almost civilized, the hint of teasing in her voice brought an answering smile to Zane's face. Don't get used to it. Can hardly breathe in this collar. Harrison appeared at the doorway, accompanied by 2 solid-looking men in their 30s, the former soldiers he had mentioned. It's time, he said, expression serious. The judge is waiting. They left through the back door, using the covered carriage Harrison had arranged. The courthouse, when they reached it, was a substantial brick building in the center of town. True to his word, Harrison led them through a service entrance and up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, where the judge's chambers were located. Outside a heavy oak door, Harrison paused, turning to Willow. Ready, Mrs. Michaels? Willow took a deep breath, drawing strength from Zane's steady presence beside her. "Ready," she confirmed. The judge's chambers were paneled in dark wood, lined with law books, and dominated by a massive desk behind which sat Judge Harmon, a man in his 60s with thick white side whiskers and penetrating blue eyes. Calvin was already present, seated to one side with a thin, nervous-looking lawyer. His eyes widened in surprise at their entrance, then narrowed with undisguised hatred when he spotted Zane. "Mrs. Michaels," Judge Harmon acknowledged, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his desk. "Please be seated. I understand this is a matter concerning the guardianship of your son, Benjamin James Michaels." "Yes, Your Honor," Willow replied, taking the offered seat while Zane remained standing protectively behind her. The judge glanced at Zane with raised eyebrows. "And you are, sir?" "Zane Alderman, Your Honor, friend of Mrs. Michaels." Calvin snorted derisively, but fell silent at a sharp look from the judge. "Very well," Harmon continued. "I've reviewed the initial filings from both parties. Mr. Michaels claims that his sister-in-law is mentally unfit to care for the child and requests that guardianship be transferred to him as the child's closest male relative. Mrs. Michaels disputes this claim and further alleges that Mr. Michaels has ulterior motives for seeking guardianship. He leaned back in his chair. "Let's begin with you, Mr. Reed. Present your client's case." Harrison stepped forward, setting a leather portfolio on the judge's desk. "Your Honor, we submit that not only is Mrs. Michaels entirely fit to care for her son, but that Calvin Michaels has falsely claimed otherwise in pursuit of financial gain. Specifically, we have evidence that Mr. Michaels planned to sell the child to a couple from Boston for the sum of $800, and that his true motivation is to gain control of his late brother's share of the family business, which was left in trust for Benjamin." Calvin surged to his feet. "That's a damned lie." "Control yourself, Mr. Michaels," the judge warned. "You'll have your opportunity to respond." Harrison continued, laying out their evidence methodically, entries from James's journal detailing Calvin's gambling debts and his brother's concerns about his character, statements from 2 residents of Virginia City attesting to Calvin's attempts to find buyers for Benjamin, documentation of the family business's value, and the terms of James's will. Throughout the presentation, Willow remained composed, though her hand occasionally sought Zane's where it rested on the back of her chair. Benjamin, as if sensing the importance of the moment, stayed remarkably quiet in her arms, watching the proceedings with solemn eyes. When Harrison finished, Judge Harmon turned to Calvin's lawyer. "Your response, Mr. Peters?" The nervous man cleared his throat. "Your Honor, these allegations are preposterous. Mr. Michaels is a respected businessman who seeks only to protect his nephew from a mother clearly unstable with grief. Mrs. Michaels abducted the child and fled, evidence itself of her disturbed mental state. We have a signed statement from Dr. Wilson of Virginia City confirming his professional opinion that Mrs. Michaels suffers from female hysteria and is unfit for motherhood." "A doctor your client paid handsomely for that opinion," Harrison interjected, "as we've documented in our filings." The judge held up a hand for silence, then turned to Willow directly. "Mrs. Michaels, I'd like to hear from you. Why did you flee with your son rather than contest these allegations through proper legal channels?" Willow straightened, meeting the judge's gaze steadily. "Your Honor, I feared for Benjamin's safety. When I refused to relinquish him, Calvin threatened me directly. He said, and I quote, 'One way or another, the boy will be mine.' I overheard him instructing Sheriff Davis to remove Benjamin from my care the following morning, regardless of my objections. I had no money for a lawyer, no family to support me, and my husband's journal made clear that Calvin had influence with local officials through his gambling connections." Judge Harmon nodded thoughtfully. "And how did you come to be in Mr. Alderman's company?" Willow glanced back at Zane briefly. "I was desperate, Your Honor. I rode north with Benjamin, stopping only when necessary. When our horse went lame, I sought shelter in the nearest structure, Mr. Alderman's barn. He found us there and, upon hearing our situation, offered protection. At considerable risk to himself, the judge observed, looking at Zane with newfound interest. Mr. Alderman, what motivated you to become involved in this matter? Zane shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the direct attention but voice steady when he answered. It was the right thing to do, Your Honor. Mrs. Michaels was clearly in distress, not deranged. And no child should be sold like property. A convenient story, Calvin interrupted, unable to contain himself. This man has been harboring my sister-in-law for weeks, hiding her from legitimate authorities. Who knows what relationship has developed between them? For all we know, he's just another fortune hunter pursuing my brother's widow for financial gain. The accusation hung in the air, crude but carrying a seed of truth that made Willow flush with indignation. Zane's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent reminder to maintain her composure. Judge Harmon studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Mr. Michaels makes an interesting point, though his manner leaves much to be desired. He turned to Zane. Mr. Alderman, do you have any financial interest in this matter? No, Your Honor, Zane replied without hesitation. I own my ranch outright, have no debts, no need for anyone else's money. And your relationship with Mrs. Michaels is? Zane hesitated, aware of the delicacy of the question. One of mutual respect, he said finally, and shared purpose in protecting her son. The judge nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. He turned his attention back to Calvin. Mr. Michaels, these allegations against you are serious. Do you deny planning to sell your nephew? Calvin leaned forward earnestly. Absolutely, Your Honor. This is a fabrication designed to discredit me. I have only Benjamin's best interests at heart. A boy needs a father figure, a man to guide him into proper society. My brother would expect nothing less of me. Yet your brother's journal suggests he had serious concerns about your character, the judge observed, tapping the leather-bound book Harrison had submitted as evidence. He writes here of your gambling debts, of money borrowed and never repaid, of threats made against him when he refused further loans. Calvin's expression hardened. My brother was mistaken in his assessment. We had our differences, certainly, but I would never harm his child. Judge Harmon leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered both parties. The room fell silent save for Benjamin's occasional soft noises as he shifted in Willow's arms. I've heard enough, the judge announced finally. This is a troubling case with serious allegations on both sides. However, the preponderance of evidence suggests that Mrs. Michaels is, indeed, a fit mother acting out of legitimate concern for her child's welfare. He turned to Calvin. Mr. Michaels, your petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from approaching Mrs. Michaels or her son without legal representation present. Relief washed over Willow so intensely that she swayed slightly in her chair. Zane's hand on her shoulder steadied her as the judge continued. Mrs. Michaels, while I understand the circumstances that led to your flight, I cannot condone taking the law into your own hands. In the future, I expect you to utilize proper legal channels for any disputes regarding your son. Yes, Your Honor, Willow agreed, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Calvin stood abruptly, face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. That woman is unfit. She's turned my nephew against me, poisoned the boy's mind with lies. Enough, Mr. Michaels. Judge Harmon interrupted sharply. My ruling stands. You may pursue further legal actions if you choose, but you will do so legally and without harassment toward Mrs. Michaels. As Zane and Willow exchanged glances of relief and gratitude, the judge banged his gavel, signifying the end of the hearing and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives.